Today is Wednesday, April 12, 2017, and it is Passover.
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot for tonight. But before we begin, let us ask our Heavenly Family to bless us. Heavenly Family, thank you so much for another Passover and a Feast of Unleavened Bread. And we come to you, Heavenly Family, wanting to cast out all leaven of wickedness and malice and pride and private interpretation and false doctrine, whatever it may be. We want to entirely be rid of it and truly have a feast of unleavened bread. Please give us the pure truth. Please make this feast the absolute best it could be and can be. And please urge us all to be of the mindset in which we can contribute the most and play our part in making this the best. Help us all to speak words of holiness, Heavenly Family. Please make us pure to be able to keep the feast as it should be kept. Help us to understand how to keep it better. Through these meetings, help us to be awakened to your love and to your ability to save us from falling moment by moment. And please, Heavenly Family, manifest a people who can bring about the final wiping away of sin. Thank you so much. Guide us. We ask all this, Father and Mother, B'Shem Tzemach, in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
There is a lot to what Passover is, what it's about, what we can learn from it, and so on. And obviously everyone is encouraged to go over the past studies that we've had on Passover and during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We have several already on YouTube and on the audio page of the bdsda.com website. And we'll see where this feast takes us, and more accurately, where the Spirit of Truth takes us during this feast. So I posted on Facebook within the past hour, it was on the Branch Davidian SDA Facebook page, kind of what we'll be doing for tonight. So, as you guys may be aware, it is a vigil tonight, which means that it's a night to stay awake and to be watching and praying, as it were. And the passage is Exodus 12:42. It says, "It was a night of vigil for the Lord to bring them out from the land of Egypt. And so on this night, all Israel is to keep the vigil to the Lord for generations to come." Or, as other translations would put it, all generations. So the idea is, on this night, it's a vigil, so we are supposed to stay up. And last year we did this, and we had meetings all night. And we'll be doing something similar tonight. However, we'll have probably less actual meeting time. But this is what I posted on Facebook, just reminding people, hey, it's a vigil. We'll be having meetings all night. And we're not setting times like, from 8 o'clock till 9:30, from 11 o'clock till 12:30, and so on. We're not setting them ahead of time because we want to be able to come to natural stopping places. And then when we come to the end of the meeting, we'll say, okay, let's get back on in however long. And so we can stop, take a break, and get back on. And what I'll do, in case anyone isn't sure, like let's say you have to go for a while and you call back in and we're not on and you're not sure what time we'll start again, what I will be doing is posting on the Branch Davidian SDA Facebook page when we will start the next session. And I'll do that after each one is done. So let's say, like, if we only go till 9:30, let's say, well then right after that, after we get off the meeting, I'd get on Facebook and say, all right, we're going to start at whatever the time is that we will be starting. And of course we'll talk about that and decide that together on the call before bringing it to an end. So everyone who's on the call, you shouldn't have to check Facebook, but I just wanted to let you guys know that it is an option, because I know that there may be different things, like some of you may be together in different places and want to have some plans for what you'll be doing together for Passover to some degree, and you might not be on for all of the meeting aspects if you're getting together. Who knows? But I just wanted to let you guys know that's an option. The other thing that I'll mention is that we will have one pretty long break in the conference calls, or in the call, in order for people to have time to search for leaven and to have the foot washing and Passover meal. So for anyone who's new to this whole thing, basically, and right now I'll just explain how it works, and we have plenty of past studies on these topics if you want to go through the evidence and all of that. But I'll explain it so you have the idea. So according to the scriptures, on the first day of the feast, so that's after sunset tonight, we are to search our houses for leaven and to cast them out of our houses. So cast leaven out of our houses. So if you have bread, if you have leaven for making bread, and that, to specify leavened bread. Obviously, unleavened bread is perfectly appropriate.
Baking soda, baking powder.
Yeah, baking soda, baking powder.
Baker's yeast.
Exactly. All of those sorts of things we search for, and we remove them from our houses. In the scriptures, we don't know of anything which says to destroy it or to throw it away or anything like that, but to remove it from our houses. And so after sunset tonight, and after we get off the call, you guys should have some time to do that sort of thing. And the more important thing, even than looking for that quote-unquote literal leaven, is to search for any sort of malice or wickedness or hatred or false doctrine, private interpretation, to really examine yourself and see if you have any of those things in your own way of thinking and cast that out. That's the higher principle that's there. Yet the search for actual leaven is, of course, part of the scriptural command as well, and we've studied, is that an element we are supposed to keep, or is it, quote-unquote, in antitype? Well, what we have found is that if it's part of the priestly law, it's to be kept in antitype. If it's not part of the priestly law, then we don't know of anything to say don't keep it. And what we found is that it's not actually part of the priestly law to remove leaven from the houses. All Israel was supposed to do it, and there's no connection specifically to the sanctuary or to the priests or anything like that. We're not aware of anything that connects it to the priesthood. And so, we're told that it's for perpetual generations, so we search for it. But again, if we search for leaven and put all the bread outside of our houses and yet retain wickedness in our hearts and hold on to false doctrines and so on, we won't truly be keeping the feast. And so it's so important to examine yourselves and to make sure that all of your doctrines and all of that are things that you experimentally know and that are according to a thus saith the Lord. So it's a very important time. Another aspect of casting out the leaven, of course, Victor Hodoff brought this out, is that Passover is actually a type for the separation of the righteous and the wicked among God's people. And, of course, there's the Exodus typology, and there's also the type with Judas being separated from among God's people at that time. And that's something very important to keep in mind, because we have to realize that we're in the judgment for the living, and there is a great separation that is taking place. And we ourselves, even who are closest in the circle of purity to our master, the branch, we ourselves, if we end up with taking on ourselves the mindset of Judas and not ridding ourselves of our own ideas as to how the work should be done and will be done, and our own self-glory, if we don't rid ourselves of that, we will end up being separated from the movement of truth. So it's a very solemn event. So after that experience of searching for leaven, casting it out, and examining ourselves the whole time, then we have the wonderful privilege of washing each other's feet and then partaking of a supper of the Lord together. And, of course, from the Scriptures, we know that we're supposed to have unleavened bread as part of that, grape juice as part of that, and bitter herbs as well. So a salad, essentially, and different things like that. We're going to have some romaine lettuce with some other things. So, there is a third meal today, and the example of Jesus, as recorded in the Gospels, evidently they had that meal quite late, because when they were done the meal, they sang a hymn and then went to the Garden of Gethsemane, and when they did that, it was about midnight, which was probably a little after 12 o'clock in the land of Israel, so the middle of the night. So they probably, I'm sure they didn't take 2 or 3 hours to eat. They probably started eating at what would be about, 11 o'clock, maybe even a little later, 11:30, something like that. So we'll end up having our food at somewhere at about that time. And I know we're dealing with multiple time zones here, so you guys can work it out in your own time zone. And I know that the meetings might not be absolutely at ideal times for everyone in every time zone, but that's just part of what we have to work with. But it's a wonderful blessing that we can all be here at such great distances and keep the feast together even in different time zones. So with that said, we will probably actually take a break for several hours after this first meeting so that people have time to do those things, and then we'll come on again. I just wanted to let you guys know that that's kind of the idea. And then let's say in our second meeting, maybe we'll be on for an hour and a half and then take a half-hour break and then come on again, or something along those lines. I know for us it'll be good to have breaks so that we can charge our devices and all of that. And so that's the overall idea for how we're going to do things. And I wanted to just explain that right at the beginning, just so that you guys all get the idea of what we're doing and can be thinking ahead. So does anyone have any comments or questions on that before we talk a little bit more about Passover? And there are some things that I want to say about the meaning of Passover and so on. But does anyone have comments or questions before we get to that?
So could you go over which days are the days that you're not supposed to do this and that? Like I got a few bills to pay this week or the next couple of days, so I wasn't quite clear about that.
Okay. Well, the Feast of Unleavened Bread has 2 Sabbaths within it, and that is on the first day of the feast and on the 7th day of the feast. And this, you can always, what I really recommend for everyone, because it's important for everyone to learn how to reckon the feasts. And, Leviticus 23, that's a passage that we should all try and keep in mind, because it explains the basics of each festival. And it explains there that it's the first day of the feast and the 7th day of the feast. So tonight we are entering into the first day of the feast. So that means tomorrow or Thursday, April 13, is the first day of the feast and is thus a Sabbath. And it's basically like similar to a new moon in how we go about it. It's not a day upon which we are commanded to do no manner of work, like the 7th-day Sabbath. It is a day in which we are commanded to do no servile work. In other words, no regular work. So the things that we would normally do to make money and this and that, and, it's not a day to do those sorts of things. But we know of no restriction to, say, cooking a meal or that sort of thing, doing dishes, cooking a meal. Whereas preparing meals and dishes and all those things are not appropriate 7th-day Sabbath behavior, but it is appropriate on new moons and on festal Sabbaths. So tomorrow, that's one day, so that's the first day, and then Friday is the 2nd, Saturday is the 3rd, Sunday is the 4th, Monday is the 5th, Tuesday is the 6th, and then Wednesday is the 7th. So next Wednesday is the 7th day of the feast and is also a Sabbath.
Thank you.
Yeah, not a problem. Are there any other questions? Sure.
So the night, the vigil, Passover night that, Jesus obviously was up all night in trials and everything like that. Was all Israel probably up that night anyway? I mean, and did they feel bad about having trials on Passover, on a feast day?
Yeah, that's a good question. As far as I know, well, here's the thing. It's commanded here in Exodus to have it as a vigil. We know that Exodus at the time of Jesus was not a lost scripture. They had Exodus, and, I'm sure they read it and all of that. So I don't have any historical records as to what they actually did at that time. I would think that they probably stayed awake although, of course, maybe some people fell asleep and all of that, but I'm sure it was a known thing and that it was the expectation. And as far as trials, I'm sure that they, thought, they probably knew that it wasn't really what they should be doing. But even aside from the day, you're trying an innocent man to try and condemn him to death. So at that point, they probably didn't really care that they did these trials on that day. Although, of course, they did care about not wanting to crucify him on that day, because that's just too much of a scene and it's such a big day and all of that. As far as whether they felt guilty or not, I'm sure it was different for each individual as to what exactly their experience was.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
This was the first time they'd ever done that, right?
Done what specifically?
Staying up all night, the Passover meal and all that.
Are you referring to the days of Jesus or the Exodus?
The Exodus.
Okay, yeah, the Exodus. Yeah, this is the first time. It's kind of interesting. The Exodus event, as presented in the Pentateuch as we have it, was not, quote-unquote, on Passover. It was the original Passover, and so every subsequent Passover or every annual Passover takes place on the day of the passing over of the angel, as it were. But yeah, this is the first event like this. I don't know of anything which would indicate that Passover was kept, or that the 14th day of the first month and going into the 15th was kept as a vigil or anything like that prior to the Exodus under Moses.
Thank you.
Anyone else with comments or questions? Okay. So as I said, there are some things that I wanted to mention in regard to Passover and its meaning and some of the lessons that our Heavenly Family wants us to grasp on this Passover. And, on previous Passovers, we've talked about several different things. One Passover, we talked about casting out the leaven and what the symbolism of the leaven is and how it represents private interpretation and wickedness and false doctrine and all of these different things. We've talked about that. We've talked about the meaning of the bread and the wine and studied what the Gospel of John has to say about that and how it relates to justification by faith. So we've talked about those elements before. We've talked about the separation of wicked and righteous and so on. These are all elements that we've talked about in previous feasts, so I'm not going to get all into that again. While it is so important and we should keep it in mind, there are some other elements that I think are very important for us to consider. And what it has to do with is, in a sense, the corporate experience of Israel in the Exodus itself. And of course, when I say that, it might seem to separate it from us individually a bit, but it really doesn't, because the corporate body is made up of individuals. And each individual in the Exodus originally, of course, had a personal experience in this, but as individuals, they were part of something bigger. They were part of a larger movement that was taking place. And that's what I want to discuss. Now, in the later meetings tonight, we may get into more detail on things, and what I'm actually thinking that we will do is something that I've never done before, and I'm thinking that most likely others here haven't done that, is to read through the Exodus story not as we have it in the book of Exodus presently, as in the combined account, but according to each source. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, I'll explain that in just a moment. But I'm mentioning that right now to say that right now I'm going to refer to things within the Exodus story that most likely you are all familiar with, but I'm not going to necessarily go and read every verse and pull it up and all of that, because I want to convey some ideas. But we will be reading all of these verses later tonight. So I just wanted to mention that. So I'll mention a little bit as to the sources right now, but I'm not going to go too far into it because we'll get to that later tonight. But what I mean when I say later tonight we're going to read the Exodus story according to the sources of the Pentateuch rather than the Pentateuch as we have it, I'm referring to the idea known as the documentary hypothesis, which basically understands the Pentateuch to be, the Pentateuch being the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Historians for quite some time now have recognized that these 5 books were not written by Moses, although there may be genuinely Mosaic material in them, but they weren't written by Moses as we presently have them. And we've studied that, aside from the documentary hypothesis, we have investigated that question ourselves. We actually did so during the last feast of Unleavened Bread. Actually, it was the day after. It was the Sheaf offering day. We studied this question and went through the passages in the Pentateuch that have any sort of relationship to Mosaic authorship or indicating authorship at all, and we found that no, it not only do those books not claim to be written by Moses, it's actually impossible for them to have been written by Moses. And so those studies will be available soon on the website and probably shortly thereafter on YouTube. So we found, okay, Moses didn't write it. So now the question is, who did write the Pentateuch? And the answer is no one individual. It was actually written by multiple individuals, possibly at different times. And, especially people who have been here at the Living Branch Center, whether visiting or living here, we have gone through some of that information in more detail and reading different passages where you can clearly discern 2 sources that have been woven together and that were originally separate narratives. That is definitely strong evidence that this was written by multiple individuals. There were multiple different authors, and then someone or multiple people combined these sources together to make what we have today. Well, most historians of the Hebrew Bible, after decades and decades and literally a couple centuries of research, have concluded that basically the answer to who wrote the Pentateuch is ultimately to be found in an understanding that has been referred to as the documentary hypothesis, which basically says, okay, well, here are the sources. We have 4 primary sources, and there are others that have been gathered together, and historians have actually identified these sources and have published editions of the Pentateuch that have these sources separated or color-coded or whatever. And there is actually a place on the internet where you can read the Pentateuch color-coded according to the sources. Now, I'll send out that link after this first meeting. And I will say, I have not read through each one each source separately, and I'm not advocating the documentary hypothesis as it is known. I do advocate that the Pentateuch certainly was not written by Moses. We've gained experimental knowledge of that. And that's not to speak against the Pentateuch either. It's just to say that it doesn't even claim to be written by Moses. And so it's not even a scriptural idea that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. That's not biblical at all. It's just a tradition. So definitely Moses didn't write it. Second, I definitely will agree that multiple authors are involved and that some sources can be discerned, but I don't know if every passage which is attributed to one source by historians rightfully belongs to that source. And historians actually disagree when it comes to some passages. Oh, does this belong to this source or to that source? We're not totally sure. And that's okay. It's not like historians have to be sure about everything. But I just wanted to mention that just to say, just because we're going to be going through these sources, it's not in order to say this is how it is. It's in order actually to test it. It's to test this understanding and to see, well, is this source really coherent? Is this source coherent? Can we see these as separate narratives? And then also, in doing that, and if we can find that, yes, these sources were originally separate, and this collection of passages was originally one narrative that was one telling of the Exodus story. And then this collection of passages is another narrative that is another telling of the Exodus story. And then we can compare them. What do they have in common? Where do they differ? What can we learn from each narrative on its own? And what can we learn from the combined understanding of them? So this is a way to study these writings, which will end up revealing a lot, in a sense. It will help us to look at things from a different perspective and gain a fuller understanding and perhaps a better understanding of historically what actually took place. So we'll have to see. Like I said, I have not yet conducted this experiment, but we will conduct it together. And I'm certainly looking forward to it. So we'll see, we'll get into those details when we get there. Again, we'll do that in our second meeting tonight is what I'm thinking, and perhaps through the rest of the meetings for tonight. But this first one, there are some other things I want to communicate.
Well, going through those sources will definitely help keep people awake.
Yeah, I think so. I think that actually these studies will definitely help us to stay awake because it's so different and so interesting. It'll be like reading something totally new and yet so strangely familiar. But the parts that I have read of these sources separated out, there is a continuous narrative flow in each source from what I've read. Of course, because of editing, there's a few places where there's some breaks, but overall it's a continuous narrative source, and it's different, sometimes profoundly. So we shall see. So anyway, some of the things that I want to communicate now have to do with what we as a people, as a present truth people today, can learn from the Exodus movement, as in what lessons can we learn. And there are many lessons, but there are some in particular that our Heavenly Family has put on my heart to communicate. So, Heavenly Family, sister, please help me to communicate these lessons as clearly as possible. Help me to communicate it just as you would, brother. Toda. Thank you. The ancient Israelites were in Egypt, according to the record that we have, for 215 years. They went to the land of Goshen. At first they were a privileged people, but soon became an oppressed people. The Israelites who left the land of Egypt were, culturally speaking, Egyptian. Why? They were born there. Their parents were born there. Their parents' parents were born there. When you live in a place with a people, you more or less become that people. My parents were both born in Canada. My grandfather on my mother's side wasn't born in Canada. He immigrated when he was 18, I think. And he was born in St. Vincent. And his ancestors mostly came from Portugal. Maybe his father even, or his grandfather or something. I forget how many generations back. But, he's just my mom's dad. And yet, I grew up in Canada, and I'm, as North American as you get, basically, Well, my most of my grandparents' parents came from the United States, and yet I'm Canadian. And, it's just a couple generations, but a lot happens in a couple generations. Things change. People are, when you're born into a society, it really shapes who you are. It was no different for the ancient Israelites. I've mentioned before, at least on one call, that there was never a time when there was an Israelite nation that was culturally, philosophically, and religiously isolated from the rest of the world. No, they were always part of something else. Abraham was a Mesopotamian. He was essentially a Canaanite. The place where he was from was full of Hittites. And then he had descendants and started a family group, and it became a separate tribe. And that tribe spoke a language which was practically indistinguishable from their Canaanite neighbors. It's really the same. It's the same alphabet, the instruments they had, the clothes they wore, everything. Like, they were part of a broader culture. Then, going to Egypt, they became part of that culture. And to this day, Hebrew has loan words from Egypt. The word Moses is not a Hebrew word, and nor is it an English word. But sometimes people think, oh, well, Moses is the English word. Moshe is the Hebrew way of saying Moses. Actually, no. It's an Egyptian name. It's not actually Hebrew. It's actually Egyptian. But it became a part of Hebrew. Just like in English, we have words that actually came from other languages. Those are called loanwords. So Hebrew has a bunch of Egyptian loanwords in it, and Canaanite has all these words. Why? Because Israel was never a separate culture. So when they were living in Egypt, they were very much so a part of what Egypt was. Sure, they were a subculture, just like you have subcultures within, and I'll use the broad North American culture just to encompass the United States and Canada. It is very similar, but there are differences. But let's just say we have this North American culture, and we have subcultures in that. Some are ethnic, some are religious. You know, we have Hispanic subcultures. Within that broad Hispanic subcultures, you have more narrow subcultures. You have Mexican, Brazilian, El Salvadorian, whatever. Okay, well, religious, we have subcultures. We have Christian subculture. We have Adventist subculture. Davidian subculture. Branch subculture. You know, we have all these, you know, categories within categories, if you will, but we're all North American. And that is a huge part of who we are as individuals. And for someone in Europe, well, hey, being European is a huge part. Being African, being whatever, wherever someone comes from, that is a huge part of who they are, because their language, their culture, how they think about things, all of that is shaped by this broad culture. So being part of Egypt was not a small thing for the Israelites. Egypt had an economic system that they were a part of. They participated in the language. I mean, surely they had to talk to other Egyptians. You know, you're there generation after generation. You have to be talking to each other. You must be interacting with each other in terms of finances. In fact, that happened even before they moved to Egypt. We know that they were worshiping Egyptian gods, so they were part of this Egyptian religious system. They were participating in Egyptian sacrifices. They were all, you know, really just a part of the Egyptian system. They were Egyptians like we are Canadians or Americans or whatever, you know. Egypt had feast days. They had their festivals. They had their calendar. Those Israelites were part of that. They went by the Egyptian calendar. Victor Otto talks about how God had to restore to them the true calendar when they came out of Egypt. Well, that shows that they were ingrained in a system that formed a large part of who they were. But then the Exodus, this was huge. Because the Exodus event and the Exodus movement was saying, hey, we are no longer going to be Egyptians. I mean, that's like us saying we're no longer going to be Canadians and Americans. Like, it's that dramatic. It's that quote-unquote political. It has that element to it. No, we're no longer going to be part of this nation, and we are no longer going to be a part of the economic system. We're no longer going to be a part of the religious system. We're not going to keep your holy days anymore. We are not going to keep your sacrifices anymore. We must go off into the wilderness to keep a feast to Yahweh. And that's actually what it says in Exodus, and we'll read it later tonight. They were going to leave. Why? To go and keep the feast for Yahweh. So this was talking about a huge separation. It's talking about forming a nation, forming a people. Now this is a huge movement, like not just in the amount of people, it's a huge movement in its nature, in its profound nature. It's a hugely profound change for the people witnessing it and the people being a part of it. The Advent movement is supposed to be, and we believe is, the anti-typical Exodus movement. This is actually something fundamental in Adventism, actually, although many Adventists today do not know that this is part of Advent teaching. But it is. It's also fundamental to Davidian teaching. And there's a large section in Shepherd's Rod Volume 1 that covers that. So what's the deal with Adventism and Davidia and branch and all that, and how we interact with the rest of the world? Now, to be clear, there was an element of Egypt that never left Israel. And it wasn't all entirely bad. It's not like the Egyptian language is inherently evil or every aspect of Egyptian culture is inherently evil. Likewise, not all aspects of North American culture are evil. It's not like it's wrong to speak English and, different things like that. So I'm not trying to say that the Exodus movement was an entire break from Egyptian everything, because it wasn't. But it was a break in identity. It was a break in purpose. It was hugely significant. So here's the thing. We know that as a people, we're going to a place where there is, in a very geographical sense, another Exodus on the way. The problem with ancient Israel is that they were making the geographical break without making the ideological break. At least not enough. And the wilderness was their time of education. Removing the ways of Egypt and giving them the ways of the God of Israel. I read recently something from Lois Roden where she mentioned how the sacrifice of the red heifer was meant to wean the children of Israel off of the celebration of an annual Egyptian sacrifice of a red bull to some particular god. I think his name was Typhon. And there are other sources, and for example, in the Clementine recognitions, Peter talks about how the animal sacrifices given to ancient Israel were given to wean them off of sacrificing to wicked gods, because it was such a big part of really all ancient pagan systems that they had to somehow separate from it, and they were going to continue. Because here's the other thing, too. In the ancient world, it's not like people ate meat all the time, and then they also sacrificed animals. Eating meat and sacrificing animals went hand in hand. It wasn't like, they ate meat as part of their diet, and it wasn't a sacrificial thing. No, if you were going to eat an animal, you were going to sacrifice that animal. That was just part of it. And so, for the most part, not saying that there were not exceptions to that, but for the most part, in the ancient Mediterranean world, that was the case. So it's not like all of Israel was just going to stop sacrificing and stop eating meat and all of that. No, they were going to continue. And so the idea in the Clementine Recognitions is that God greatly reduced the sacrifices and made sure that they wouldn't sacrifice to other gods. Because if they did that, then they're essentially not at all changing in their way of thinking. But that was to be a temporary state of affairs until the true prophet should come, using the words of the Clementine Recognitions. The true prophet, of course, being Jesus. So here's the thing. If Israel, while in Egypt, had made this ideological change and said, "Oh, wait a second. We are no longer Egyptians. We are Israelites. We're the children of Jacob, servants of Yahweh, not servants of Pharaoh, not servants of Ra. We're servants of Yahweh, Israelites." And if they grasped that and what that meant, and if they actually had the change in identity which they were supposed to have, they would not have had to wander for 40 years in the wilderness to be re-educated in the ways of God. So today, on this Passover, while we reflect on the ancient Exodus, let's keep in mind that we have just as real and just as profound of an Exodus ahead of us. And that we need to make the ideological break from the Egypt of today, the world, before we leave. If we don't, we may well have something worse for us than 40 years wandering in the desert. So let's make that break from the world. Be ye separate is the phrase. It's not to say, again, that we stop speaking English. It's not to say that every aspect of North American or whatever culture, like for anyone, wherever they're from, but most, if not all of us on the call right now are North American. So not all elements of that culture are bad, but we can be in it, but not of it. I mean, what are people interested in? What are the goals of the North American culture? Are those really the goals that we ought to have? Ought we to really live like that? Or are we to be a peculiar people? Friendly with everyone, friends with everyone. We certainly can and should be in communication with all of our surrounding neighbors. Just like the children of Israel, it would have been wrong for them while in Egypt to isolate themselves and to not talk to the Egyptians and not have any interaction with the Egyptians and all of that. Well, how are you going to witness to anyone doing that? No, that wouldn't work. That wouldn't make sense. But they were to be people of integrity and not compromise on principle. And that's what we are called to. While we are here in the lands of the Gentiles, we are called to become Israelites, servants of Yahweh. We are not to be North Americans, South Americans, Europeans, Asians, Africans, whatever. Our identity is not to be shaped by the culture in which we find ourselves. We are to be the people of Yahweh. We are to be branch people. And taking that as our identity, we will talk like branch people, eat like branch people, dress like branch people, think like branch people. Every culture has its own way of being and doing, and we need to be that people. If we are going to make a difference, we need to be that people. Israel was called to be a holy nation, set apart for Yahweh, to be a light to the world. That's what we are called to. We are supposed to be different. You know how the Jewish people today, just in the world, from the perspective of the world and all of that, it's a different people. Even though many Jews are no longer religious Jews, but they still keep their identity as Jews because it's just such a different culture, subculture. It can be embedded within many different cultures, but still retain some amount of separateness, distinctiveness. And, in the scientific community, there's a lot of Jews, more than you would expect. There are less Jews than there are Seventh-day Adventists in the world. Yet, there are more Jews have won Nobel Prizes than any other subculture. By far. And it's like, okay, what's up with that? They are a distinctive people that the world can really look at and say, oh, yeah, they're definitely different. So in a sense, that's kind of what we're supposed to be like. Of course, no example is perfect other than the example of Jesus. And that is the perfect example. Jesus was in the world, but he was not of the world. He didn't do things the way people did things. He didn't play this whole honor-shame game that his surrounding people did like they did. Here they are, and they have a system where, someone who is of a lower rank in society isn't supposed to say certain things, isn't supposed to do certain things. But Jesus said and did those things. He spoke boldly as one of authority. He loved his enemies. That's unheard of. He loved his enemies. He talked about a new and different kingdom. His followers talked about a new and different kingdom. Caesar was called the Son of God. Well, Jesus' followers said, no, Caesar isn't the Son of God. Jesus is the Son of God. It was a rival kingdom. And that's what Jesus spoke of, a kingdom. Now, to be clear, he still functioned within that kingdom. He didn't despise Romans. He didn't want to start a revolt against the Romans. He said, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Because that's not how Jesus did his revolution. He understood that you may kick the Romans out of the land and bring an end to Gentile rule, and in a sense then have another quote-unquote exodus. He understood that even if all of that was done, but the people still kept the wrong mindset, that wouldn't change anything. What good would a Jewish Palestine with no Romans be if the Jews just did everything the same way as the Romans? What good would a returned Jewish people from Babylon be if they did everything the same way as the Babylonians? You know, basically they would be a Gentile nation with the name Jew. So Jesus' way was different. He said, no, ideology. Let's deal with the way of thinking. The rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, but it shall not be so among you. On Passover night, Jesus instituted an ordinance, the washing of the feet, which taught the principles of his kingdom. He was calling out a people. He was calling out a nation, just like the Exodus movement of old. But in his kingdom, he that is greatest is least. It's the kingdom of service. It's the kingdom of humility. The kingdom where people don't do things as most people do things. And that's what our Heavenly Family wants of us. That's what they are calling us to. And seriously, guys, we have some real options before us. We could choose to just go through life as we typically go through life and get on the calls every once in a while, or even faithfully all the time, get on the calls when we have calls, study, and then go back to our regular life. That's not what we are supposed to do. If we do that, we can't expect to participate in any sort of exodus. If we do that, all of this stuff is just going to be stories to us. We have to do something totally different. If there's going to be a change, we have to make the change happen. That's how it is. That's how it has always been. You cannot expect that one day some great power will take hold of you and now you're suddenly a revolutionary who's going to make this great change in your life and in the world. No, that's not just going to magically happen one day. Your life will pass you by if you continue to just, live life as is, get together, study, la-di-da, whatever. That's not how it's going to happen, guys. The only way for us to do this the only way for us to change the world. And this world is a world that we should recognize that we need to change it. Evidently, no one else is, at least not for the better, in a long-lasting, ultimate, total way. The reason why I add that qualification is because, of course, there are some people out there who are genuinely doing something good to better the world. There are people making advances in medicine in order to help people, making advances in technology to provide clean water, and there are things like that. But as we've talked about time and time again, the problems of the world will not go away until selfishness goes away. Poverty, disease, starvation, war, all of these things will continue so long as selfishness continues, because they're rooted in selfishness. So as noble as some of these causes are, and they are noble, the most noble cause that could ever be is to bring an end to selfishness in the world. And that's exactly what the message of Jesus is all about. Jesus came 2,000 years ago to bring that message. That's not evidence that his plan of operation is a failure. It's only evidence that people haven't really tried it out yet. And we have to do it. No one else is doing it. No one else is doing it, so we have to do it. If we care at all about this world and about the people in it, we need to really do something different. Sometimes I look around at the people here in Hearst, and people have their jobs and are doing, what they're doing, making a living, living a good life, going fishing and hunting on the weekends or whatever. Yeah, sure, there's a pleasantness to life. But man, if we live to let ourselves relax for an hour or two each day, maybe a little bit more on the weekends and all of that, and let this world continue on the way it's going, we are not going to help anything, including ourselves. This world needs a change. Our Heavenly Family has given us the message to bring that change. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free.
Amen.
If truth was reigning in this world, this would be a far different place. Error is manifestly reigning, with corruption at her side. And all things are indeed becoming greatly and increasingly corrupted. This whole thing is fast falling apart, as I'm sure you guys can all see. I don't take time to watch the news, but every once in a while I see something on Facebook, and the world is not good. The truth makes all the difference. If people think according to truth, they will act according to truth. Right and wrong. Truth and false. The words truth and falsehood describe correspondence or lack of correspondence to material reality insofar as ideas are concerned. If your idea matches material reality, it's true. If it doesn't match, it's false. Good and bad describe harmony or lack of harmony with material reality insofar as actions are concerned. If you act out of harmony with reality, that is bad, that is immoral. If you act in harmony with material reality, that is good, that is moral. But our actions spring from our thoughts. Thus, if we think according to truth, we will act according to truth. It is as simple as that. It is a simple, simple, simple solution. But this world, as Isaiah puts it, darkness covers the earth, and gross darkness the people. But arise and shine, for thy light has come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon thee, O daughter of Zion, O branch movement, daughter of Zion, mentioned in Ezekiel 16. How dare we hide our light under a bushel and let the world suffer on in darkness, thinking according to error, acting according to error, killing each other, causing each other to be in poverty and disease and starvation, having unclean water. We must shine the light. We need to be that people. We need to be the people who will say, no, I'm no longer of this world, because I can see that this world is corrupt and full of error. No, I am going to be a child of light. I will no longer be a child of darkness. I will be a child of light. I will no longer be just another North American. No, I'm going to be different, and I am going to not mind at all sticking out like a sore thumb. I will proudly bear the branch name and proclaim what it is all about. Because you know what? Let's face it, people in this world are actually looking for something different. At least anyone who at all recognizes that things are not as they should be. So we need to be that people. We need to be preparing for the biggest event that has taken place in the history of the world. And that is the full establishment of the kingdom of God. This is what Jesus was trying to bring about. Unfortunately, they killed him. Fortunately, our Heavenly Family had a plan to make that event to be the greatest thing to possibly bring about the kingdom of God. About 2,000 years ago, 31 AD, on this night, Jesus and his disciples were gathered together. He had come to Jerusalem knowing that there were people planning to take his life. Not long before, when he was coming to Jerusalem, he looked over the city and wept. Seeing the Roman flags, seeing the city that was about to fall, he knew that he was not going to be accepted, and that the kingdom of God would not then be established. And so when he was there with his disciples, he wanted to give them the privilege of doing greater things than he did. He couldn't establish the kingdom, not as he wanted to, but he wanted to establish it still through his disciples. So he showed them how they must be humble. They must not live to serve themselves. They must live to serve others. This is the key difference between the world and the kingdoms of darkness and the heavenly kingdom. And then he gave them bread and grape juice as reminders of his body and his blood, indicating that he was giving himself for them, lowering himself, humbling himself, that he was following the very principle that he was trying to teach them and was about to give them the greatest example of it that one could possibly ever have. Judas left. Then they went to Gethsemane and they prayed together. Or at least that's what they were supposed to do.
Right.
He prayed, they slept. Some people to start the kingdom with, hey? Here he just gives them the principles of the kingdom. He realizes, okay, you know what? This is not going to work the way that it was supposed to work. I'm going to die, but I'm going to give them the principles that they need to establish the kingdom, and they'll do greater things than I have done. He promised them the Holy Spirit. And then they fall asleep. They can't stay up. They can't put in the effort to help their friend and master. He had just told them not to live for themselves and give in to their own gratification, but to do something for him. Could they not stay up even an hour to help him? No, they gratified themselves by giving in to the desire of their flesh to sleep. That showed that they were not ready to be soldiers in the army. That showed that they still had a work to be done for them in order for them to be able to establish the kingdom. If they didn't sleep, they would not have run away and abandoned him. They slept. They were being selfish. When the Roman soldiers came and arrested Jesus, they fled. These are lessons for what not to do. We need to be better than that. Jesus was better than that, and he had no advantage other than an understanding of the truth. But how does he get that? Through the same means that any and all of us can. Inspiration had spoken. He devoted himself to understand it, and he was blessed. Today, inspiration has spoken. If you devote yourselves to understand it, you will be blessed. Jesus had a day of trial, and then he was crucified, rested in the grave, rose again the third day. 50 days later, the Spirit came down on the day of Pentecost. people had been called out and a government had been given to them. Netzarim, branches. And that movement, in a few short decades, revolutionized the world and had an influence that even Jesus himself did not have within his own ministry. And it would have gone all the way. And it could have gone all the way. But the mystery of iniquity works so subtly. And how did it start? People allowed selfishness to come in. So today, the kingdom of God has sprouted in the wilderness. Our Heavenly Family is attempting to bring about an exodus, and our opportunity today is very, very real. There has been an increase of potential for good or potential for bad, but we have a huge potential. So I really want you guys to examine yourself as to where your mind is really at. Are you in the world? What do you think of every day? What do you spend your time thinking about and doing? Are you thinking about and doing the things of this world? Do you look around and see all your fellow North Americans and you're pretty much doing the same thing as they are, only you have this other additional aspect of life where you study and you get on conference calls and you know some things that they don't know about the Bible? Is that your true state? Or are you a revolutionary doing everything you can to change this world? And incidentally, doing some of the things that the North Americans around you happen to be doing. Yes, you converse with them. Yes, you enjoy their fellowship. Yes, you shop in their grocery stores. Yes, you pay taxes. Yes, all these things. But that's just incidental to life. That's just doing the things you need to do in order to live and function, in order to bring an end to falsehood and bring about the reign of truth. What's your focus? And if it is not to do everything you can to bring an end to falsehood and the reign of truth, do not expect the world to change. But you can change that. The moment you realize that your focus is not where it needs to be, just that moment, you have an opportunity to change that. Sometimes when someone realizes something about themselves, they suddenly go into, woe is me, oh no, look at what I'm like. How is that going to help you? You're just digging yourself deeper in the hole. Don't do that. Once you realize that your focus is wrong, realize, oh, my focus is wrong. I'm going to choose the right now. I'm going to change my focus now. When I was 13, the mistake that I made is, oh, my motives are wrong. And then I allowed that thought to define me And then I went through 4.5, 5 years of being happy with the thought of going to hell because I didn't think I had any other option. Can you believe it? I wasted 5 years of my life doing stupid things simply because I had a thought that my motives were wrong and I allowed that to define me rather than making a choice. Our calling card is about to go out. I'm going to hang up and call right back in. I apologize for the necessary pause in this, but thank you guys for being so patient and everything. So what I was saying is I wasted 5 years of my life because I accepted the thought that, oh, well, this is just who I am. No, who we are is not defined by what we have done and how we have thought. Guess what? The moment that you realize what you have thought and have done, those thoughts and actions are in the past. In the past. And they can stay there. You don't need to bring them into the present with you. This is so important. This is what Paul realized. When you read Romans 7, there's a series of realizations that Paul goes through. He's a sinner. He's a slave to sin. He knew the law. Well, he didn't have the law. And then he felt alive, but then the law came and he died. In other words, when he heard the instructions of God and he heard the counsel of God, he's like, oh man, look how dead I really am. And also, he went further into rebellion because his heart wasn't right. But then he's realizing, wait, the law is good. Because if it wasn't for the law, I wouldn't realize how bad this is. So the law is actually helping me out. And then he had a very profound realization. He said, I delight to do the law, but what I want to do, I don't do, and what I do, I don't want to do. And he says, it is not I that do it, but sin dwelling in me. That is the key difference. When he came to that realization, that's when he said, who shall save me from this body of death? And then Romans 8, salvation. So what's the thing that made the difference? What is it that really got him to call out for a Savior? To realize that he's a slave, or better put, realize that he is in slavery to sin, but that is not who he is. That's not what he is about. He separated himself. He chose that he wasn't going to allow that to define him. He wasn't going to be, woe is me, I am a sinner. I am a sinner. I am a sinner. Yes, he realized I am a sinner. He had to realize that on a very deep level. And he had to realize that the instructions of God were not against him in telling him that he's a sinner. That they are actually for his benefit. And then he had to realize this whole sin business is not where it's at. This is slavery, but I am not going to allow that to define me. It's not me. Notice how his identity is not with sin. And no one who thinks according to truth will have their identity be with sin. Why? Because sin is acting according to error. If you think according to truth, sin is not your identity. In other words, there is no way to think Sin is who I am. A sinner is who I am without thinking according to the ways of falsehood. Who you are supposed to be, who you were created to be, your individuality, is actually only contaminated by sin. Sin is what corrupts your individuality. It is not your individuality. It is not who you are. It is what you have been slave to. So Paul had the profound realization that that's not who he is. It's sin in him doing these things, but he wasn't going to allow that to happen. So then he cries out for a Savior because he realizes that he is enslaved. Another example of this, let's just take an African slave in the American South. If he thinks I'm a slave, he and his children, if they think the same way, may continue on, not rising above that slavery and the effects of that slavery. But if that African realizes, I'm not a slave, I am a man, or I'm not a slave, I am a woman who has been enslaved, who has been put in slavery, but that's not my identity. I'm not a slave, but they have wrongfully enslaved me. That person will be able to rise above their slavery and their effects of their slavery because they are not allowing it to define them. That is a person who will have deliverance, who will have salvation.
Amen.
That's what the Israelites were supposed to be. They were enslaved to a foreign nation and to sin. They were supposed to realize that while they were enslaved, they were not slaves. The Exodus is all about liberation. This is what our Heavenly Family invites you guys to no longer be enslaved to the system of this world, and to be no longer enslaved to sin. Realize that you are not a slave as your identity. You are not a sinner as your identity. If you sin, yes, you are a sinner in that it describes your actions. Indeed. But that is not your inherent personhood. That's a corruption of you. It's not you. Realize that and wake up to who you are supposed to be. And move forward with your new identity being who you are supposed to be. Then you can change the world. Then you will no longer go on in this monotony of being a North American who knows more about the Bible than your neighbor, who comes on conference calls and who studies, and who eats twice a day at set times, and who does these other things that, are kind of different from your other American friends or your other Canadian friends or whatever. No. If we're going to start this kingdom, we need to be the people of a new kingdom. We need to be the children of the kingdom, the children of light. So that's what our Heavenly Family burdened me to communicate to you guys in this first meeting. So I ask that you contemplate it and that you bring these principles into your search for leaven And that when you wash each other's feet tonight, that you don't do it as a form, but that you do it as a covenant. That you make a binding agreement to no longer live for yourself, but to live for others. And that as you cast the leaven out of your homes, you cast the lies out of your hearts.
Amen.
The lies that tell you, oh, this is who I am. I'm someone who's resisting justification by faith. Well, if you allow that to define you, you're not going to get anywhere. Cast that out. Cast it out of your home. So cast that stuff out of your home, and then wash each other's feet, commit to serve each other, and then enjoy the meal that Christ gave us to show what the kingdom is all about. Through his death we have life. So amen.
Amen.
So I'll tell you guys what I'm thinking now as to how we should go about things. And if anyone has comments or questions, on this topic, we can do it. I don't want to get to other things. I want to get off the call with you guys thinking on these principles. So I have to say that just to say, if you have something on another topic or anything, maybe in the next meeting later tonight, we can talk about that. But if anyone wants to express themselves praising our Heavenly Family, or if you have a question about anything that I just said, feel free to do that, and then we'll discuss what we're going to do in terms of the call. So anyone? Okay, perhaps not.
Well, I do. I just wanted to give others a chance to say something. This was exactly what we needed to hear tonight, and I was just wanting to, I just wanted to voice that and to say thank you, Heavenly Family. It was, it's a blessing. I look forward to contemplating it more.
Amen. Todah, thank you, Heavenly Family.
I just want to voice that I'm thankful that we wallow in our sin and we need to just knock it off, and it's such a positive thing to be able to just set the sin aside and just move on to the kingdom in our mind, just to change our ideology and forget about the sin. Quit wallowing in it, quit using it as an excuse, and instead of it being a negative, it's a positive to just move on from.
Amen.
Amen. I must say also that just the telling of the comparative relationship between ancient Israel and Egypt and us today with whatever area we're living, and the cultures and all that, so very practical, so helpful.
Amen.
Yeah.
Let's actually just thank our Heavenly Family. I know we've been doing it already, but I just want to pause for a moment and really just thank them, and then we'll talk about how long we'll take a break for in the meeting. So, Heavenly Family, Todah HaRabah, thank you so much. Thank you for the truth. Thank you for pleading with us. Thank you for giving us wise saying after wise saying. Wisdom, thank you for continuing to speak to us and to not leave us to wallow in the ways of wickedness. Thank you for establishing for us a way of truth. Please guide us as we continue on through this Passover evening. Help us to do just what you want us to do. Give us light and truth. Send your angels to the homes of each one. Thank you. We ask this and again praise you. B'Shem Tzemach, in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.